Section 35 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Seascape with Frieze of Girls, Part 2. I went indoors because I was to dine at Rivebelle with Robert, and my grandmother insisted that on those evenings, before going out, I must lie down for an hour on my bed, a rest which the Balbec doctor presently ordered me to extend to the other evenings also. However, there was no need, when one went indoors, to leave the front and to enter the hotel by the hall, that is to say, from behind. By virtue of an alteration of the clock which reminded me of those Saturdays when at Combray we used to have luncheon an hour earlier, now with summer at the full, the days had become so long that the sun was still high in the heavens, as though it were only tea time, when the tables were being laid for dinner in the Grand Hotel. And so the great sliding windows were kept open from the ground. I had but to step across a low wooden sill to find myself in the dining room, through which I walked, and straight across to the lift. As I passed the office, I addressed a smile to the manager, and with no shudder of disgust, gathered one for myself from his face, which, since I had been at Balbec, my comprehensive study of it was injecting and transforming, little by little, like a natural history preparation. His features had become familiar to me, charged with a meaning that was of no importance, but still intelligible, like a script which one can read, and had ceased in any way to resemble those queer, intolerable characters which his face had presented to me on that first day, when I had seen before me a personage now forgotten, or, if I succeeded in recalling him, unrecognizable, difficult to identify with this insignificant and polite personality, of which the other was but a caricature, a hideous and rapid sketch. Without either the shyness or the sadness of the evening of my arrival, I rang for the attendant, who no longer stood in silence while I rose by his side in the lift, as in a mobile thoracic cage, propelled upwards along its ascending pillar, but repeated, "There aren't the people now there were a month back. They're beginning to go now. The days are drawing in." He said this not because there was any truth in it, but because, having an engagement presently for a warmer part of the coast, he would have liked us all to leave, so that the hotel could be shut up, and he have a few days to himself before rejoining in his new place. Rejoin and new were not, by the way, incompatible terms, since, for the lift boy, rejoin was the usual form of the verb to join. The only thing that surprised me was that he condescended to say place, for he belonged to that modern proletariat which seeks to efface from our language every trace of the rule of domesticity. A moment later, however, he informed me that in the situation which he was about to rejoin, he would have a smarter tunic and a better salary, the words livery and wages sounding to him obsolete and unseemly. And as, by an absurd contradiction, the vocabulary has, through thick and thin among us masters, survived the conception of inequality, I was always failing to understand what the lift boy said. For instance, the only thing that interested me was to know whether my grandmother was in the hotel. Now, forestalling my questions, the lift boy would say to me, "That lady has just gone out from your rooms." I was invariably taken in. I supposed that he meant my grandmother. "No, that lady. I think she's an employee of yours." As in the old speech of the middle classes, which ought really to be done away with, a cook is not called an employee. I thought for a moment, but he must be mistaken. We don't own a factory. We haven't any employees. Suddenly I remembered that the title of employee is, like the wearing of a mustache among waiters, a sop to their self-esteem given to servants, and realized that this lady who had just gone out must be François, probably on a visit to the coffee-maker, or to watch the Belgian lady's little maid at her sewing. Though even this sop did not satisfy the lift boy, for he would say, quite naturally, speaking pityingly of his own class, "with the working man," or the small person, using the same singular form as Racine when he speaks of the poor. But as a rule, for my zeal and timidity of the first evening were now things of the past, I no longer spoke to the lift boy. It was he now who stood there and received no answer during the short journey on which he threaded his way through the hotel, hollowed out inside like a toy, which extended round about us, floor by floor, The ramifications of its corridors, in the depths of which the light grew velvety, lost its tone, diminished the communicating doors, the steps of the service stairs which it transformed into that amber haze, unsubstantial and mysterious as a twilight, in which Rembrandt picks out here and there a window-sill or a well-head. And on each landing a golden light reflected from the carpet indicated the setting sun and the lavatory window. I asked myself whether the girls I had just seen lived at Baalbek, and who they could be. When our desire is thus concentrated upon a little tribe of humanity which it singles out from the rest, everything that can be associated with that tribe becomes a spring of emotion and then of reflection. I had heard a lady say on the front, "She is a friend of the little Simonette girl," with that self-important air of inside knowledge, as who should say, he is the inseparable companion of young La Rochefoucauld. And immediately she had detected on the face of the person to whom she gave this information a curiosity to see more of the favored person who was a friend of the little Simonette. A privilege, obviously, that did not appear to be granted to all the world. For aristocracy is a relative state, and there are plenty of inexpensive little holes and corners where the son of an upholsterer is the arbiter of fashion and reigns over a court like any young Prince of Wales. I have often since then sought to recall how it first sounded for me there on the beach, the name of Simonette, still quite indefinite as to its form, which I had failed to distinguish, and also as to its significance, to the designation by it of such and such a person, or perhaps of someone else, imprinted in fact with that vagueness, that novelty which we find so moving in the sequel, when the name whose letters are every moment engraved more deeply on our hearts by our incessant thought of them has become, though this was not to happen to me with the name of the little Simonette until several years had passed. The first coherent sound that comes to our lips, whether on waking from sleep or on recovering from a swoon, even before the idea of what o'clock it is or of where we are, almost before the word I, as though the person whom it names were more we even than we ourselves, and as though after a brief spell of unconsciousness, the phase that is the first of all to dissolve is that in which we were not thinking of her. I do not know why I said to myself from the first that the name Simonette must be that of one of the band of girls. From that moment I never ceased to ask myself how I could get to know the Simonette family, get to know them, moreover, through people whom they considered superior to themselves, which ought not to be difficult if the girls were only common little bounders, so that they might not form a disdainful idea of me. For one cannot have a perfect knowledge, one cannot affect the complete absorption of a person who disdains one, so long as one has not overcome her disdain. And since, whenever the idea of women who are so different from us penetrates our senses, unless we are able to forget it or the competition of other ideas eliminates it, we know no rest until we have converted those aliens into something that is compatible with ourselves, our heart being, in this respect, endowed with the same kind of reaction and activity as our physical organism, which cannot abide the infusion of any foreign body into its veins without at once striving to digest and assimilate it. The little Simonette must be the prettiest of them all, she who, I felt moreover, might yet become my mistress, for she was the only one who, 2 or 3 times half turning her head, had appeared to take cognizance of my fixed stare. I asked the lift boy whether he knew of any people at Baalbek called Simonette. Not liking to admit that there was anything which he did not know, he replied that he seemed to have heard the name somewhere. As we reached the highest landing, I told him to have the latest list of visitors sent up to me. I stepped out of the lift, but instead of going to my room, I made my way farther along the corridor, for before my arrival the valet in charge of the landing, despite his horror of draughts, had opened the window at the end, which instead of looking out to the sea, faced the hill and valley inland, but never allowed them to be seen, for its panes, which were made of clouded glass, were generally closed. I made a short station in front of it, time enough just to pay my devotions to the view which for once it revealed over the hill against which the back of the hotel rested, a view that contained but a solitary house, planted in the middle distance, though the perspective and the evening light in which I saw it, while preserving its mass, gave it a sculptural beauty and a velvety background, as though to one of those architectural works in miniature, tiny temples or chapels wrought in gold and enamels, which serve as reliquaries and are exposed only on rare and solemn days for the veneration of the faithful. But this moment of adoration had already lasted too long, for the valet, who carried in one hand a bunch of keys, and with the other saluted me by touching his verger's skull-cap, though without raising it, on account of the pure, cool evening air, came and drew together, like those of a shrine, the two sides of the window, and so shut off the minute edifice, the glistening relic, from my adoring gaze. I went into my room. Regularly as the season advanced, the picture that I found there in my window changed. At first it was broad daylight, and dark only if the weather was bad, and then in the greenish glass which it distended with the curve of its round waves, the sea, set among the iron uprights of my window like a piece of stained glass in its leads, raveled out over all the deep rocky border of the bay little plumed triangles of an unmoving spray delineated with the delicacy of a feather or a downy breast from Pisanello's pencil, and fixed in that white, unalterable, creamy enamel which is used to depict fallen snows in Gaillet's glass. Presently the days grew shorter, and at the moment when I entered my room, the violet sky seemed branded with the stiff, geometrical, traveling, effulgent figure of the sun, like the representation of some miraculous sign, of some mystical apparition, leaning over the sea from the hinge of the horizon as a sacred picture leans over a high altar, while the different parts of the western sky exposed in the glass fronts of the low mahogany bookcase that ran along the walls, which I carried back in my mind to the marvelous painting from which they had been detached, seemed like those different scenes which some old master executed long ago for a confraternity upon a shrine, whose separate panels are now exhibited side by side upon the wall of a museum gallery, so that the visitor's imagination alone can restore them to their place on the predella of the reredos. A few weeks later, when I went upstairs, the sun had already set, like the one that I used to see at Combray, behind the Calvary, when I was coming home from a walk and looking forward to going down to the kitchen before dinner. A band of red sky over the sea, compact and clear-cut as a layer of aspic over meat. Then, a little later, over a sea already cold and blue like a gray mullet, a sky of the same pink as the salmon that we should presently be ordering at Rivebelle, reawakened the pleasure which I was to derive from the act of dressing to go out to dinner. Over the sea, quite near the shore, were trying to rise, one beyond another, at wider and wider intervals, vapors of a pitchy blackness, but also of the polish and consistency of agate, of a visible weight, so much so that the highest among them, poised at the end of their contorted stem and overreaching the center of gravity of the pile that had hitherto supported them, seemed on the point of bringing down in ruin this lofty structure already half the height of the sky, and of precipitating it into the sea. The sight of a ship that was moving away like a nocturnal traveler gave me the same impression that I had had in the train of being set free from the necessity of sleep and from confinement in a bedroom. Not that I felt myself a prisoner in the room in which I now was, since in another hour I should have left it and be getting into the carriage. I threw myself down on the bed, and, just as if I had been lying in a berth on board one of those steamers which I could see quite near to me, and which, when night came, it would be strange to see stealing slowly out into the darkness, like shadowy and silent but unsleeping swans, I was on all sides surrounded by pictures of the sea. But as often as not they were indeed only pictures. I forgot that below their colored expanse was hollowed the sad desolation of the beach, traveled by the restless evening breeze, whose breath I had so anxiously felt on my arrival at Balbec. Besides, even in my room, being wholly taken up with thoughts of the girls whom I had seen go past, I was no longer in a state of mind calm or disinterested enough to allow the formation of any really deep impression of beauty. The anticipation of dinner at Rivebelle made my mood more frivolous still, and my mind, dwelling at such moments upon the surface of the body which I was going to dress up so as to try to appear as pleasing as possible in the feminine eyes which would be scrutinizing me in the brilliantly lighted restaurant, was incapable of putting any depth behind the color of things. And if, beneath my window, the unwearying, gentle flight of sea martins and swallows had not arisen like a playing fountain, like living fireworks, joining the intervals between their soaring rockets with the motionless white streaming lines of long horizontal wakes of foam, without the charming miracle of this natural and local phenomenon, which brought into touch with reality the scenes that I had before my eyes, I might easily have believed that they were no more than a selection, made afresh every day, of paintings which were shown quite arbitrarily in the place in which I happened to be, and without having any necessary connection with that place. At one time it was an exhibition of Japanese color prints. Beside the neat disk of sun, red and round as the moon, a yellow cloud seemed a lake against which black swords were outlined like the trees upon its shore. A bar of tender pink, which I had never seen again after my first paint box, swelled out into a river on either bank of which boats seemed to be waiting high and dry for someone to push them down and set them afloat. And with the contemptuous, bored, frivolous glance of an amateur or a woman hurrying through a picture gallery between two social engagements, I would say to myself, "Curious sunset, this. It's different from what they usually are, but after all, I've seen them just as fine, just as remarkable as this." I had more pleasure on evenings when a ship, absorbed and liquefied by the horizon, so much the same in color as herself, an impressionist exhibition this time, that it seemed to be also of the same matter, appeared as if someone had simply cut out with a pair of scissors her bows and the rigging in which she tapered into a slender filigree from the vaporous blue of the sky. Sometimes the ocean filled almost the whole of my window, when it was enlarged and prolonged by a band of sky edged at the top only by a line that was of the same blue as the sea, so that I supposed it all to be still sea, and the changing color due only to some effect of light and shade. Another day the sea was painted only in the lower part of the window, all the rest of which was so filled with innumerable clouds, packed one against another in horizontal bands, that its panes seemed to be intended, for some special purpose, or to illustrate a special talent of the artist, to present a cloud study, while the fronts of the various bookcases, showing similar clouds, but in another part of the horizon and differently colored by the light, appeared to be offering, as it were, the repetition of which certain of our contemporaries are so fond, of one and the same effect always observed at different hours, but able now in the immobility of art to be seen all together in a single room, drawn in pastel and mounted under glass. And sometimes to a sky and sea uniformly gray a rosy touch would be added with an exquisite delicacy, while a little butterfly that had gone to sleep at the foot of the window seemed to be attaching with its wings at the corner of this harmony in gray and pink, in the Whistler manner, the favorite signature of the Chelsea master. The pink vanished. There was now nothing left to look at. I rose for a moment, and before lying down again drew close the inner curtains. Above them I could see from my bed the ray of light that still remained, growing steadily fainter and thinner. But it was without any feeling of sadness, without any regret for its passing, that I thus allowed to die above the curtains the hour at which, as a rule, I was seated at table. For I knew that this day was of another kind than ordinary days, longer, like those Arctic days which night interrupts for a few minutes only. I knew that from the chrysalis of the dusk was preparing to emerge, by a radiant metamorphosis, the dazzling light of the Rivebelle restaurant. I said to myself, "It is time." I stretched myself on the bed and rose, and finished dressing, and I found a charm in these idle moments, lightened of every material burden, in which, while down below the others were dining, I was employing the forces accumulated during the inactivity of this last hour of the day only in drying my washed body, in putting on a dinner jacket, in tying my tie, in making all those gestures which were already dictated by the anticipated pleasure of seeing again some woman whom I had noticed last time at Rivebelle, who had seemed to be watching me, had perhaps left the table for a moment only in the hope that I would follow her. It was with joy that I enriched myself with all these attractions so as to give myself, whole, alert, willing, to a new life, free without cares, in which I would lean my hesitations upon the calm strength of Saint Loup, and would choose from among the different species of animated nature and the produce of every land those which, composing the unfamiliar dishes that my companion would at once order, might have tempted my appetite or my imagination. And then, at the end of the season, came the days when I could no longer pass indoors from the front through the dining room. Its windows stood open no more, for it was night now outside, and the swarm of poor folk and curious idlers, attracted by the blaze of light which they might not reach, hung in black clusters, chilled by the north wind, to the luminous sliding walls of that buzzing hive of glass. There was a knock at my door. It was Aimée, who had come upstairs in person with the latest list of visitors. Aimée could not go away without telling me that Dreyfus was guilty 1,000 times over. It will all come out, he assured me. Not this year, but next. It was a gentleman who's very thick with the general staff told me. I asked him if they wouldn't decide to bring it all to light at once before the year is out. He laid down his cigarette. Aimé went on, acting the scene for my benefit, and shaking his head and his forefinger, as his informant had done, as very much to say, we mustn't expect too much. Not this year, Aimé. Those were his very words, putting his hand on my shoulder. It isn't possible, but next Easter, yes. And Aimé tapped me gently on my shoulder, saying, You see, I'm letting you have it exactly as he told me. Whether because he was flattered at this act of familiarity by a distinguished person, or so that I might better appreciate, with a full knowledge of the facts, the worth of the arguments and our grounds for hope. It was not without a slight throb of the heart that on the first page of the list I caught sight of the words Simonette and family. I had in me a store of old dream memories which dated from my childhood, and in which all the tenderness that existed in my heart, but when my heart felt it was not distinguishable from anything else, was wafted to me by a person as different as possible from myself. This person, once again I fashioned her, utilizing for the purpose the name Simonette and the memory of the harmony that had reigned between the young ladies which I had seen displaying themselves on the beach, in a sportive procession worthy of Greek art or of Giotto. I knew not which of these girls was Mademoiselle Simonette, if indeed any of them were so named, but I did know that I was loved by Mademoiselle Simonette, and that I was going, with Saint-Loup's help, to attempt to know her. Unfortunately, having on that condition only obtained an extension of his leave, he was obliged to report for duty every day at Doncières. But to make him forsake his military duty, I had felt that I might count, more even than on his friendship for myself, on that same curiosity, as a human naturalist, which I myself had so often felt, even without having seen the person mentioned, and simply on hearing someone say that there was a pretty cashier at a fruiterer's, to acquaint myself with a new variety of feminine beauty. But that curiosity I had been wrong in hoping to excite in Saint-Loup by speaking to him of my band of girls, for it had been and would long remain paralyzed in him by his love for that actress whose lover he was. And if he had felt it lightly stirring him, he would have repressed it, from an almost superstitious belief that on his own fidelity might depend that of his mistress. And so it was without any promise from him that he would take an active interest in my girls that we started out to dine at Rivebelle. At first, when we arrived there, the sun used just to have set, but it was light still. In the garden outside the restaurant, where the lamps had not yet been lighted, the heat of the day fell and settled, as though in a vase along the sides of which the transparent, dusky jelly of the air seemed of such consistency that a tall rose tree fastened against the dim wall which it streaked with pink veins looked like the arborescence that one sees at the heart of an onyx. Presently night had always fallen when we left the carriage, often indeed before we started from Balbec if the evening was wet and we had put off sending for the carriage in the hope of the weather's improving. But on those days it was without any sadness that I listened to the wind howling. I knew that it did not mean the abandonment of my plans, imprisonment in my bedroom. I knew that in the great dining room of the restaurant, which we would enter to the sound of the music of the gypsy band, the innumerable lamps could triumph easily over darkness and chill, by applying to them their broad coteries of molten gold, and I jumped light-heartedly after Saint-Loup into the closed carriage which stood waiting for us in the rain. For some time past, the words of Bergot, when he pronounced himself positive that in spite of all I might say, I had been created to enjoy preeminently the pleasures of the mind, had restored to me, with regard to what I might succeed in achieving later on, a hope that was disappointed afresh every day by the boredom that I felt on setting myself down before a writing table to start work on a critical essay or a novel. After all, I said to myself, possibly the pleasure that its author has found in writing it is not the infallible test of the literary value of a page. It may be only an accessory, one that is often to be found superadded to that value, but the want of which can have no prejudicial effect on it. Perhaps some of the greatest masterpieces were written yawning. My grandmother set my doubts at rest by telling me that I should be able to work and should enjoy working as soon as my health improved. And our doctor, having thought it only prudent to warn me of the grave risks to which my state of health might expose me, and having outlined all the hygienic precaution that I ought to take to avoid any accident, I subordinated all my pleasures to an object which I judged to be infinitely more important to them, that of becoming strong enough to be able to bring into being the work which I had, possibly, within me. I had been exercising over myself, ever since I had come to Baalbek, a scrupulous and constant control. Nothing would have induced me there to touch the cup of coffee which would have robbed me of the night's sleep that was necessary if I was not to be tired next day. But as soon as we reached Rivebelle, immediately, what with the excitement of a new pleasure, and finding myself in that different zone into which the exception of our rule of life takes us after it has cut the thread, patiently spun throughout so many days, that was guiding us towards wisdom, as though there were never to be any such thing as tomorrow, nor any lofty aims to be realized, vanished all that exact machinery of prudent, hygienic measures which had been working to safeguard them. A waiter offering to take my coat, whereupon Saint-Loup asks, "You're sure you won't be cold? Perhaps you'd better keep it. It's not very warm in here." No, I assured him, and perhaps I did not feel the cold, but however that might be, I no longer knew the fear of falling ill, the necessity of not dying, the importance of work. I gave up my coat. We entered the dining room to the sound of some warlike march played by the gypsies. We advanced between 2 rows of tables laid for dinner, as along an easy path of glory, and, feeling a happy glow imparted to our bodies by the rhythms of the orchestra which rendered us its military honors, gave us this unmerited triumph, we concealed it beneath a grave and frozen mien, beneath a languid, casual gait, so as not to be like those music-hall mashers, who, having wedded a ribald verse to a patriotic air, come running on to the stage with the martial countenance of a victorious general. End of section 35.